let's start with the favorite, right? This is the book that 10 years ago just shook up a lot of Christians, unfortunately. Believers walked away from the faith because of this book. I guess what was the difficulty of the book is at the beginning, before it starts in on the story, it says all of the evidence, all of the historical information is correct. Basically what he's saying, I just made up the characters. And so you think, okay, so we're going to learn some good history. We're going to learn some good theology as we go through Da Vinci Code. Well, no. He got all sorts of things wrong. He got his art wrong, and he got his theology wrong as well. This is one little quote. This is about 200 pages into the book. It is an exciting read. Anybody read Da Vinci Code? Yeah, it's a great read, isn't it? It's a lot of fun. Unfortunately, once it turns to theological matters, especially the idea of what the Gospels are really like, it just goes way off a cliff. But here's one thing that it said in there. The Bible is a product of man. It's evolved over countless translations. More than 80 Gospels were considered for the New Testament. I bet you didn't know that. Anyway, the Bible, as we know, was collated by the pagan Roman Emperor Constantine. Now, Constantine is in the 300s, so do you hear what it's saying? For 300 years, nobody really had a favorite gospel. They were just all out there, and then somebody, under Constantine, they got this council together, and sat down to spread out all these gospels and said, I'll take that one, no, I don't like that. I'll take that one. And so it was this process. It was totally artificial by just a powerful group of people that set it up and then just kind of shoved it down everybody's throat. That's the message from the Da Vinci Code. Well, it's not the only one, though. Here's somebody that you ought to keep track of, because Bart Ehrman right now is the best-selling author dealing with ancient manuscripts as far as Gospels go. I don't know if any of you ever get these pamphlets or product pieces at your house called the Great Courses. Yeah. Okay. They come out like every week, and they're just huge. I'm thinking, man, a lot of money is going into this thing. They're beautiful, glossy things. So I got one about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I opened it up to the section about religion. And guess who's doing about 90% of the things about the New Testament? Bart Ehrman. He's a professor at the University of North Carolina. And here's the deal. Ehrman grew up as a Christian. He was a Christian. And he studied under probably the best textual critic. We'll talk about textual criticism a little bit later. But anyway, that's people who study ancient manuscripts. He studied at Princeton under the leading textual critic who was an out-and-out Christian. He fully believed in the Gospels and the traditions that the church talked about and things like that. But he walked away from the faith. And now he's spending his life undermining it as much as he can. Book after book, though, have been bestsellers. He's got his own website. He goes on cruises, and people, flock to him. I was teaching out of Palomar a few months back, and I was in a workroom someplace, and there was a teacher there, and she said, "Are you teaching the Bible as literature?" And I said, "Yeah, it's a lot of fun." She said, "Oh, that's great." She said, "I love the Bible. I've been reading about it." And I said, "What have you been reading?" She said, "Bart Ehrman." I said, "Okay." I said, "Just keep in mind, he's way over on one end." I said, "So here's some other information." I gave her some other details. But here's what Bart Ehrman had to say. There are discrepancies and contradictions, all sorts of historical errors and mistakes. It's difficult to know what Jesus actually said and did. Other books were at one time considered canonical, meaning, on par with whatever we would say today. But ultimately did not become part of Scripture. For example, other Gospels. Here we go again, right? Here's that thing about other Gospels. We're going to talk about that today. A good number of the books are pseudonymous, right? We don't know who wrote them. Just written in the name of an apostle. We don't have the original copies of any of the biblical books, but only copies made centuries later, all of which have been altered. So let me stop there for just a second. Is everybody in here aware that we do not have the original Mark, or Matthew, or Luke, or John? We don't have the original. They're not framed someplace. They're not in the Vatican, hidden away. Or that's the favorite thing. Make the Vatican the bad boys. They're hiding stuff all over the place. No, we don't have the originals. So in a sense, he's always close to the truth, but he doesn't give you the whole truth. So what do we have instead? He's right. We have copies. Anybody ever have old paperbacks at home that were printed way back in the 40s or 50s, and they start yellowing, and if you go to open them, they crack, and the pages just start almost disintegrating? Well, that's what you have with papyrus, right? That was the original written material that they used. And it's just a matter of over time, papyrus just crumbles. It doesn't last. And so You don't have the originals, right? So people get a little nervous about that, but we'll talk about what we don't have to be worried about. So he makes this claim, we don't have the originals, but we just have copies. Now, here's where he's getting off base a little bit, and we'll touch on this later. He says, made how long? Centuries later. So you hear what he's trying to get across, that somebody wrote out Matthew at one time, and then 200, 300, 400 years later, somebody said, I'm going to recreate that. Well, he may get this huge gap, chances are there's some problems there. Well, he's not telling you the whole story, but this is out there, right? So these are the kinds of things that we're going to be dealing with today. So let's start in on letter A. You have an outline in front of you, I hope. Everybody got one? Got a copy? Okay. So we'll start in letter A. Let's take the standards, not just for the Bible, let's take the standards used for any ancient manuscript. How do people who study these things decide whether they can trust them or not? Well, here's the first way you can trust them. Here are the two. How close are they to the original? Remember, we don't have the originals, but how close are they? In other words, would you trust something that you looked at and you were able to date within 10 years of the original? Would you trust that more than one that you dated 200 years from the original? You would, wouldn't you? You'd say, well, chances are if it's closer, there's probably less chance for error to creep in, right, as people are writing these things out and copying them. And then, of course, how many copies exist? What's the advantage to having a whole lot of copies? Remember, we don't have the originals, but what if you had a whole lot of copies?
You can cross-reference.
You cross-reference them, right? It's like somebody wrote a recipe, and you got it from that person. They didn't have it written out, ahead of time, a bunch of copies, but they just hand wrote it to you, and then they hand wrote it to somebody else, and they hand wrote it somewhere else, and you look at it and you go, this calls for cups. It can't be cups of something. I bet it was teaspoons, but you're not sure. But would you agree the more copies you had, you could lay them all out there and say, oh yeah, it is teaspoons. It's teaspoons in 9 out of the 10. I just got the one that said cups. All right, so that's what we're talking about. How many copies do we have to look at? So let's take that first issue. How far from the originals do we have? I hope this doesn't confuse you. I was trying to give you a kind of a quick look at it here. Let's take the 4 people at the top. These are people who historians look at and say, we can trust that we can reconstruct really closely whatever they said originally. Well, look at Caesar. What are we talking about? 950 years till we have the first copy of Julius Caesar. And yet, have you ever sat in a classroom someplace where somebody has said, well, we can't really trust this, but here's what we have, good luck? Nobody says that. They say, this is what Caesar said. This is what Caesar did. We're pretty sure, even though 950 years have gone by since his original manuscript disappeared, crumbled, and we have our first copy. Plato, Tacitus, Homer, hundreds of years in each case, right? Look at Tacitus, for heaven's sakes, 1,000 years. And yet, if you take a class in Roman history, they're probably going to reference Tacitus. They're not going to say, well, we don't have any idea, just, this is the best hope. No, they'll say, we think that we've reconstructed it pretty carefully. So how do we do, I put a little gap here, how do we do when we come down to the New Testament? Is the gap smaller? Right, it's a lot smaller. We've got scraps going back. Now, these are not complete New Testaments, right? We're not even talking necessarily complete Gospels, but we've got pieces of it going back to 125. And here's what's really interesting. There's something new going on. They have just been doing some research in Egypt. The poorer people would create a mask for somebody who died, but they didn't have the exotic materials like the rich did. So they would take pieces of parchment, almost like paper mache, and glue them together and form a mask for somebody who had died. Well, they've got those masks now. They're uncovering them more and more. And they found that, I think if you use Palmolive, just some kind of basic soap, you can pull those fragments apart. And guess what they're finding? Pieces of the Gospels. And they're coming back, from what I hear, I don't think anybody's officially stated this yet, but it's going back to the 1st century. So you're talking just a short span between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and the first pieces that they're beginning to find. In fact, it wasn't that long ago that the book of Revelation was being put down. People said, oh, that didn't get written until the late 100s. John was around 70 or 80 AD, let's say, but it was somebody else that wrote it clear up into the maybe 170s, 180s. And then guess what they found? They found a piece of the Gospel of John that was dated to about 125. So anyway, they're finding these things closer and closer to when they got written. So this is good news, isn't it? Compared to ancient literature, we're not saying you have to believe it yet. We're saying if you apply the same standards to the four Gospels as you do to these other famous authors, and nobody seems to have a problem with them, then I think we're looking pretty good, right? This looks nice. Yes?
So then, when would be the earliest copy of a complete version of it?
Yeah, it's called Codex Sinaiticus. It's a mouthful, but they found it in the Sinai Desert. And it's about, I think, about 250 or 300
Still
AD.
yeah.
Somewhere right around there. By the way, another quick story. There's a guy back in the late 1800s, and he's really interested in studying these ancient documents, and he's trying to track them down. And people told him, well, this monastery called St. Catherine's, which is in the desert there, if you just go there, I think they've got some ancient manuscripts. So he goes there, and a monk takes him up to a room, and he says, it's pretty cold. He says, we'll get a fire going for you. Okay. So he brings in a basket, not of wood. They don't have wood there in the middle of the Sinai. But it's like old scraps of manuscripts and stuff, and they start feeding these into the fire, and he gets kind of curious. He goes over and he looks in the basket, and he goes, wait a minute, because he knew Greek. He said, you're burning copies of the New Testament, So he goes, time out. And he starts digging through it, and he finds scraps all over the place, and was able to reconstruct a whole lot of the New Testament. They kind of makes you wonder what else has happened, but anyway, so this is good news, right? This is wonderful as far as how far from the originals. How about how many manuscripts? Amazing. Just compare. Now, Homer's looking pretty good, right? If you think about it. Homer has over 1,000 manuscripts that people could lay out if they wanted to, just to cross-check and make sure that, is this really what he said in this line? Is this really what the second line says, right? They have 1,500. That's terrific. But nobody seems to complain. Tacitus, we got 3. That's it, total. 3 ancient manuscripts. Handwritten copies. You can just put them down right here on one table, right? There it is, 1, 2, 3. And yet people look at it and they say, we trust this. We think we can still reconstruct Tacitus, even though we only have 3. Homer, like I said, is the best. And by the way, these keep getting added to as they scrounge around different places and come across new manuscripts. So at one time, maybe you've heard Homer, there are just 600. Well, that was years ago, and they keep coming across new ones. Look at the New Testament. Over 5,000 in the original Greek, and that doesn't count all the copies that were made by these other languages because they wanted to get the Gospels in their own languages, and something that people tend to skip over and don't think about, the church fathers. In other words, the early Christians who ran churches said, boy, this is powerful stuff. And so they would write a sermon out by hand. They'd say, as Luke says, so you could reconstruct that part of it, right? Or as John says, right? So you got these church fathers for the first 200 or 300 years that they're making hundreds of thousands of references to the Bible. And you put all those together, you could reconstruct the New Testament just from them. Even if you lost all of these, even if you lost all the Latin, even if you lost all their other languages, you could still reconstruct it just from the church fathers. Thank goodness for them, huh? Mm-hmm. Sat around and actually wrote out things just like Joe's doing and all, right? They reference Bible verses and all. So how are we doing as far as this goes? It's unbelievably better than the other ancient documents. Here's an exercise, just a mental exercise. Somebody once figured out if you took most of those famous other ancient writers, and if you could take the average, right, what we have, the average, and stack them here from any one author, right? So that's the picture. And of course they're written on sheets of like paper. It would come up something like 4 feet. All right. So if it was Tacitus or whoever, right, you average it up. So any one Greek author, the average is 4 feet. Any guesses? Think about that leap between how many copies we have of the New Testament and the other ancient writers. So you got a 4-foot stack that represents an ancient Greek. How big would the stack be, do you think, from the New Testament?
Half a mile?
Half a mile. It's double that. It's 1 mile.
Oh my gosh.
Does that give you an idea of 4 feet, 1 mile? Right? So that's the kind of richness that we have. It's an amazing thing. So we're in really good shape when it comes to that. Here's another complaint or charge against the New Testament, though, the Gospels is, well, we don't know that eyewitnesses really wrote about it. It could have been hundreds of years later. People just wanted to tell nice stories about Jesus. How do we know there are really people who were there? So here are just a few ways, and we're covering a lot of territory today, so obviously we could go into depth on this, and there's just not the time. But how about the statements by the authors themselves? Right? They claim that they were there. They talk about things going on, things that were said. They talk about hanging out with Paul and all sorts of things. The dating, we're going to come across that. I'm going to show you a slide in a second. The dating seems to work pretty well for what's said inside the stories. We'll come back to that. There are creeds not hidden, but people don't really think about them. There are creeds inside a lot of Paul's letters, and I'll show you how that will connect to the Gospels in just a second. The church fathers. We're back to the church fathers again. What did they say? Well, some of them said, hey, I was taught by John, and he wrote the book. And then that church father died, and the next church father says, I was taught by so-and-so who was taught by John. Right? So that's what I mean by a chain of custody. You can track it for hundreds of years, these people that say, I was taught by, I was taught by, I was taught by. So it's all connected, right? And they say it goes back to these people, Mark and Peter and Matthew, and all these people are involved. They said they were there. The history is amazingly accurate. If you were to write something 300 or 400 years later, you're not going to be able to get the history as well as they did. I'll just give you one example, but again, this is just a really rich field. Luke, he tells in the book of Acts a lot of Paul's missionary voyages, right? He gets the names of all the church officials and the town officials correct, because they were different every place you went. Somebody might be called a oligarch or something in one place, but they wouldn't be called that someplace else. He got all of those names right. Nobody would have known that hundreds of years later. He got the way you sailed a ship in those days. He got all of that correct. He got the wind directions right. I mean, just the ports, the way the ports worked, and all this kind of stuff that we would sort of skim over as we're reading it, but he got it all correct. In the book of John, John talks about Jesus healing at the pool of Bethesda. You heard of that one? And he says there were 5 porticos, like 5 columns there. 5, not 4, not 10, 5. Then, of course, Jerusalem gets wiped out by the Romans in 70 AD. So if you were to reconstruct or try to write history 300 years later, how do you know how many porticos there were? And so they did some work there, some archaeological work. Guess how many porticos they found? Not 3, not 4, not 50. They found 5 porticos. They said, recent scholars have been saying that there was no first century Nazareth, that it was a later town. Well, that would kind of hurt the Gospels, right? The Gospels say there was a first century Nazareth. Guess what they've uncovered recently? First century Nazareth, right? So there's all this stuff that, as far as the history and the archaeology goes, is very supportive of somebody who was there at the time writing this. Yes?
I know you're talking about the Gospels, but actually the historical accuracy, if you go all the way back to the Old Testament, from the Babylonian, the Persians, to the Greeks, to the Romans, actually the accuracy of that is pretty amazing, and the continuity into the Gospels. But
yes,
the historical accuracy of the Bible, it's just amazing.
It is.
All the way back to the beginning of the civilization.
Joe said he's run something called True You here at the church. Stephen Meyer, who's the person who runs that, has a whole section on the reliability of the Old Testament, because we tend not to think about that as much, or we think, well, that's just ancient history. But yes, you're right. There's so much accurate in the Old Testament. It's amazing. All right, how about the third from the bottom here? This is why these Gospels were picked out of all these stories that were floating about Jesus. They were always put through a filter. One of the filters was this done by an eyewitness or somebody who knew the eyewitnesses? Otherwise, right, they were out. Nobody wanted that. So that was one of the criteria they used to say, yeah, we'll read this. So let's take the book of Mark, for instance. Mark wasn't one of Jesus' disciples, but all the early church fathers agree that who was it that he hung out with? Peter. And so people will say, okay, we're going to accept the book of Mark because he's so tightly associated with Peter. And of course, Matthew was a disciple, and John was a disciple. And Luke says at the beginning, he went and talked to the people and hung out and got to know them that way as well. And then if you're going to make this stuff up hundreds of years later, why would you take 2 of the Gospels and name them after lesser people, right? There's no Gospel of Philip. I mean, why wouldn't you name, Gospels after people over there? Instead, you get Luke. He's not even a Jew. He's a Gentile. And Mark, he's not one of the 12, right? So you would only say those are authentic if they were authentic, right? And they were there. Otherwise, you'd say, let's make up some more important people writing these Gospels. They're embarrassing details that you wouldn't put unless they were authentic eyewitness accounts. Can you think of anything embarrassing about either what Jesus is saying or what the disciples are doing that probably happened? Otherwise, you wouldn't put it in there.
Peter denying Christ.
Yeah, he denies Jesus. And this is the guy later on that the church is going to say, this is our rock, this is what we're going to build our church on. Well, if you're going to make this stuff up hundreds of years later, you're going to have Peter standing in the front, right? He's strong, he'll stand firm, and he'll say, come on, you guys, we know Jesus is coming back, and from the dead. No, it didn't happen that way.
And they mentioned that Mary and Martha were the first eyewitnesses to the resurrection.
Oh, women, yeah, in those days, their testimony didn't count very much. So you would say, no, it had to be Peter. Yeah, he's going to show up first. No. So these at least suggest eyewitness accounts. Now, I went past a couple. I said, let me show you on some later slides. Let's take a creed. Oh, so what's a creed? A creed is a short, easy, memorable kind of statement about what you believe, right? Sometimes you work at a business and it may have what they call a mission statement, right? So it's the same thing. There are a lot of them buried throughout Paul's letters. And what they do is they reinforce the idea of eyewitnesses because they tell you the same story that the Gospels tell you. And what's cool is the creeds go way back. They go back actually earlier than the Gospels. Are you aware of that? The creeds are earlier than the Gospels. Even the best way of thinking about the Gospels is maybe in the 50s they got written down. Well, Jesus was in the 30s, so you got at least a 20-year gap, and nobody's going to argue about that. There probably really was a 20-year gap before they started writing down the Gospel stories. We're going to come back to that later, because some people are going to say, wait a minute, we got 20 years going by, I'm a little nervous about that. No, we'll come back to that. The creeds, though, many suggest this creed, I'll read it in a second, goes back to within maybe a year of Jesus. So if it tells the same story that the Gospels do, you could then move the Gospels back and say, okay, they're eyewitness, they're at the same time. Well, does this tell the same story? This is Paul. He says, for what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance. Let me stop there. That's language we don't get today, but what he is saying is, this is a creed that I didn't make up. People told me this, and I'm now passing it along to you Corinthians. Okay, does that make sense? So this is what Paul is saying. This is something that got delivered to me. I think it's great. It's exactly right. I am now passing along to you. So let's see what that creed is. Christ died for our sins. He was buried, raised on the third day. He appeared to Peter, appeared to all these people. Isn't that the gospel story? That's what the Gospels say. He's not changed that. He doesn't say, well, there's a few differences here. It's the same story. So that's good news, right? It says even the earliest accounts are the same things that the Gospels tell us. And I'm sure you recognize some of these things as creeds, even if they don't show up like neon lights, when you're reading. But Paul's letters, like take Philippians. Do you remember that part where it says Jesus humbled himself and came to the earth, and it's set up kind of like a little poem? That was an early creed. That was a little song that they used to sing in their church service. It's in Colossians. It's all over the place. And now research is being done. People are finding those so interesting because they do go back so much further. They go back so close to the time of Jesus. Some people suggest this one may have actually been formulated in the fall of the same year that Jesus died.
Wow.
That's pretty close, huh? That's amazing. Well, what about that timeline that I told you about? Okay, let's take a look at that. When were these Gospels written? Now, I'm going to give you a timeline here, and unfortunately, because of the way the screen looks, I'd like to set it up on a horizontal line. I can't do that, so you have to kind of twist it in your head here. And I'm actually going to start at the bottom and work back. Now, not everybody agrees with this, but I think you can make an excellent case for how early the Gospels were. Some people want to late date them, right? They don't trust them, they don't believe them, they want to push them off as far as they can toward the end of the first century. I think that's a mistake. See if this makes sense to you. Let's start down here. Everybody agrees, right, that Jerusalem got attacked in 70 AD, and it was surrounded, besieged. The Romans came in. Boy, the Romans were thorough. If they wanted to take you out, they took you out, right? So they came in and just ruined the place. They starved the people out and finally invaded, and it was just utter disaster, chaos. Everything was ruined. Do you think that was a big deal to the Jews? It was huge, right? Do you think if you were writing something about Jesus, would you include something? If you wrote it after 70 AD, would you include that? Did Jesus ever talk about the temple coming down, for instance? Yeah. So if you're going to write it in the 80s or the 90s or 100s, you'd say, just as Jesus said, the Romans came in, took it all apart. Because remember, he said not one stone is going to be left up there on the wall. People said, what are you talking about? It's beautiful. What kind of insurrection was this? But notice it's not in the Gospels. What's at least one conclusion to me, and a lot of people say, if it's not in the Gospels, and it could have been to substantiate what Jesus said, maybe they were written before. Well, let's keep going with that theory. Again, historians will give you the mid-60s is the time period for the death of Peter and Paul in Rome, right? It's the time of the first attack on the Christians under Nero. Remember that old story about Nero fiddling while Rome burned? There really was a part of Rome burned, and so he had to blame it on somebody, so the Christians got to blame. And that was the first breakout of real hostility to Christianity. So they were put to death, probably in the mid-60s. Okay, let's think about the book of Acts. Acts ends with both Peter and Paul still alive. So let me ask you, if you're the author of Acts, you're sitting there and you're writing it up, and you know that Peter and Paul have died, would you include that? Yeah. Look at what happens earlier in Acts. Who's the first martyr? Stephen. Is a lot of space devoted to Stephen's death? He gets a whole chapter of his speech, and then the death. And I mean, that's a lot of space devoted to the first martyr. Is Stephen as well known as Peter and Paul? No, absolutely not. If you're going to devote that much space to the death of Stephen, I mean, I'm just thinking logically, if my main heroes die off, man, I'm going to put that in there. It's not in there. So what's a logical assumption? Probably Acts was written before the mid-60s. Okay, so now we're getting a little closer. But notice Acts is not the first book of Luke's, right? That's his second book. So what does that do? That puts Luke, I would say, and a lot of people agree, it's earlier, right? So that maybe in the 50s, and Luke's not the first gospel. Nobody thinks he's the first one that set down the stories of Jesus. Most people think Mark was earlier, and Mark may have been the first one. So where does that put Mark? Maybe early 50s AD. So we are still talking about a 20-year gap, but that's a lot better than what a lot of real critical historians who don't like the whole Christianity thing, they want to push it as far as possible. I think you can pull it a little closer. I just wish the Gospels actually had a date on them. You know, like we write letters today. You know, January 30th, 15. You know, there's something they don't have it. So we try to guess. We try to reconstruct. Yes.
What about Q? I heard is the source for a lot of the Gospels. Is that really like Mark may have started with Q or been part of? Would that have been even earlier potentially than Mark?
Yeah, you know that. I feel sorry for these people that study this stuff because there just isn't a whole lot of hard evidence there, and so there is a theory that this it's a German word, Quelle or something. It stands for source. They say that Mark and Matthew somewhat and Luke had an earlier source. Well, here's the catch: there's no evidence. There's no evidence. They don't have one scrap that they can say, yeah, Q. So it's just a hypothetical thing. So I don't know.
I see. Yep.
Hard to tell. Okay. So any question? Yes.
I was just going to say. Even that 20-year gap, there's a lot of people who would have been alive spanning those 20 years from when Jesus died. So,
sure.
So if you're going to lie during that time, people may very well come forward and said, no, this was bunk or whatever.
Yes. Well, keep in mind, too, where did all of this start? Jerusalem.
Right there.
They didn't go to Central America and say, trust us. Here's the gospel. They didn't go to Vladivostok and say, trust us. They did it right there. And so when these letters got written, you're right. When these Gospels got written and they said these things happened, those people, Paul's one of them that says you can go talk to them. Many of them are still alive. And so there's the challenge. Yes?
Yeah, actually, with the three major religions today, which is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they all recognize the existence of Jesus.
Yes.
None of them deny it.
No.
The difference, the stumbling block is his deity and what he is.
Yes, who is Jesus?
Right.
That's right.
There's a whole book of Mary that is written about Jesus' birth in Quran that people don't know. It's called Maryam. It describes the entire birth incident, but they just come short of calling him the Son of God.
Yeah.
And of course, the Jews recognize that he did come, but he was just a good rabbi and teacher.
That's right.
And just us as Christians recognize it. So his existence actually is recorded in different books than just the Bible.
There really are no historians of any credit at all who still say that he didn't exist. Right, there are a few crackpots, but not people who publish, not people who are at a well-known university or something. They all agree Jesus lived. You're right. Then the question is, so what did he really do? Who was he? And we'll cover that when we talk about the uniqueness of Jesus. All right, so let's talk about the sources. So we say, well, so 20 years went by. How did they put together the Gospels? Where did they come from? Well, we got a huge clue from Luke. Luke at the very beginning is very honest. He says, here's where I got my sources. He said, many have undertaken to draw up account of these things as they were handed down, right? There's that word handed down. That phrase means oral tradition. Okay, we don't get it today. It doesn't make sense to us, but they understood that term handed down. as oral tradition. So he said they're handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So what's he saying? I got my information handed down to me orally. I sat down, I said, tell me about Jesus. What did you see? What did he say? What happened here? And Luke says, I very carefully wrote this all down, and that's my gospel. So at this point, I think a lot of people are probably, you're probably not in the same category, but a lot of people get very nervous with the idea of oral tradition. They're going, are you kidding me? So for 20 years, it was just oral stories of Jesus that got passed around. And the first thing people think of is playing the telephone game.
Yeah.
And you go, good heavens, you can't pass a story around, 5 or 10 people without it getting all changed and ruined and all. And they go, oh, all of a sudden, I'm not sure I trust the Gospels anymore if it took 20 years. Well, let's look at that. Oral tradition. Can you trust oral tradition? It's not like the telephone game. Can you think of any reason why the Gospel stories, the oral tradition part, would not be like playing the telephone game?
So many involved.
So many
Just
people.
one to one to one.
That's true.
One person is talking to other people, and they
Well,
wouldn't be able to change it.
But you had a lot of people sitting around hearing Jesus, right? They could kind of self-correct afterwards. Did he say, blessed are the so-and-sos? Yeah, okay, and then he said that, right? So you're right. The telephone game is private. That's part of the fun, right? Because you whisper it, and you whisper it, and you whisper it, and it comes around. Ho, ho, that's a lot of fun. Yeah, so this is different. You're right. There are a whole lot of people involved. How else is it different than the telephone game?
Well, at least from my opinion on this one, actually you lose credibility if you embellished your story. Or in that time, people trusted the oral tradition more than written because they got something written. Like, I don't know who wrote this, but if they went to Gary, I don't want to hear about it. I want to talk to Gary, and I want to hear what Gary has to say about this, or Peter. Yeah. That had much more credibility than a written book, so that's why they didn't put an emphasis on writing it down for.
Yeah, we're talking about an oral society, aren't we? Today, we can copy anything down. So some of you had your phones out one quickly, right? So you don't even have to hear me. You just have to, put it on the screen there. I can't remember my own phone number. Honestly, I have my cell phone, and I have to scotch tape my number on the back. And people say, what's your number? Give me a second. I mean, we don't remember anything anymore, do we? We don't have to. That's the good news, right? It's in print somewhere. But this is an oral society. Have you heard some of the amazing things that people have been able to memorize in these societies? There are people in Muslim countries who memorize, catch this, the Quran, not a verse, not a chapter. They've memorized the Quran. That's roughly the size of the New Testament. They know the whole thing. And so when we compare our memory and say, well, I don't know how they could remember anything that Jesus said, oh yeah, they could. That was the job of a rabbi's disciple. What's his job? Sit there and memorize what that guy says. And he's going to say it a lot of times. He's going to say it more than once. After all, Jesus did the Sermon on the Mount. But if you go to Luke, it says he was on the plain. It's the same message. Right? So it's a Sermon on the plain. Doesn't sound as good, does it? Sermon on the Mount just sounds better. You're kind of looking out over everybody. So there are some other reasons. Plus, would you agree that when you play a telephone game, it's just kind of silly and for fun? There's nothing serious that's going around. It's not like the cure for cancer.
Right.
Right? It's some stupid statement. It comes around and you go, oh, I got it wrong. Ha ha. I mean, Jesus is talking about what's going to happen to you when you die. He told you about what the Old Testament was all about. He told you who he was. He told you these amazing, memorable stories of the prodigal son or the Good Samaritan. People can memorize those kinds of things. Yes?
Well, also, what you say is as reliable as your character. If a person is of a good character and you know they don't lie, they don't cheat, you know them like they did, then you take them for truth. While somebody is kind of a shady personality, so you don't just believe anything we hear from just anybody, but persons that we have known to be reliable and true speaking.
Yeah, exactly. It's a good point. Did we cover most of these things? Oh, one thing here, as far as Jesus speaking in a memorable way, do you notice how many times he would say things in double or triple repetition? He would say, ask, seek, and knock, right? Which is kind of cool, because then I get the A and the S and the K, and you do that I have to do little memory devices there. But so his disciples would have heard things that were said in a nice way. They would go, "Oh, that's really interesting." And so part of that, I think, is the way it would lock it into your mind. Yes.
And you mentioned before, like some of the creeds and the songs, and I'm sure that played into it as well. That some of the things that he taught might have been put to music at some point.
Could be. Yeah. Okay, so are we all right not to worry so much about a few years of oral traditions? Here's another complaint, or at least a worry some people have. Gosh, they say, a lot of the Bible, or a lot of the Gospels don't seem to be exactly the same as we go from Gospel to Gospel. We read the story in one Gospel, we read the same story in another Gospel, and we go, well, wait a minute. This isn't exactly what I thought was in there, right? Because we're used to modern history. Modern history says, if this is what the person said, whoever writes a story about that person better get those exact words. If it says on June 10th this happened, it better be June 10th, book after book after book, right? And we don't see that when we come across the Gospels. Let me give you a couple of examples. Look at the baptism of Jesus. Matthew says it's slightly different than Mark, at least reporting the words of God. In Matthew, this is my son. What does it say in Mark? You are my son. Do you hear the pronoun differences there? First one, is this person out here, and the other one says it's talking like to Jesus, right? So it's different. So people look at it and go, "Boy, I don't know if I trust this." They can't get their stories exactly straight. How about Jesus talking about the future? Well, in Matthew, he says, "When you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel, flee, right? Get out of there." That's not what Luke says. When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, well, that's already a little different. You'll know that its desolation is near, and then the end is about the same, isn't it? Flee, get out of there. And so people look at that and they go, well, so somebody got it wrong. Well, that's because we're saying that they should have written history like we write it today. That's not true. Back in the ancient days, have you heard of Plutarch? Plutarch is probably the best known biographer. He would write biographies of people whose lives overlapped, and so sometimes you'd hear the same story more than once because he was talking about people who knew each other and things that happened. He would tell the same event different ways every time. You were allowed to do that. The idea was in ancient biography, remember we're talking ancient times, ancient biography was just to get the gist of what somebody said. You didn't have to get the exact wording. And you could move events around if you wanted to. You can make all sorts of changes. So when you, I didn't put it on the screen, but when you look at Jesus' temptation, the order is different. Okay, but that was considered fair and it's okay to do. So it's really wrong to judge ancient literature by our standards today. Nobody got it wrong. They're trying to emphasize something different as they wrote these different accounts. Let's take this one. Why would Luke leave out all this stuff about Daniel, right? Daniel doesn't appear in Luke. He's a Gentile, and he's writing for Gentiles, right? Jesus is supposed to be the Savior of the world. So somebody's reading this stuff and they're going, who in the world's Daniel? Right. We go, yeah, we got it. Well, good. Yeah, I hope we do. But back then they're going, who's Daniel? Who's Matthew writing for?
The Jews.
He's a Jewish author, and Jesus is the most Jewish there, right? What does Daniel do? What does Matthew do? He says, as it was said in the Old Testament, he keeps bringing up Old Testament references because Jesus is a fulfillment of the Old Testament. When you see the biography or the lineage of Jesus, he takes them back to Abraham. Luke doesn't do that. He takes them back, Jesus' lineage back to Adam, because Jesus is for the whole world. The other one is, well, we're kind of looking at the Jewish perspective here. So again, we're not judging the way they wrote by the standards today because their standards are completely different. So these are not mistakes. These are just a looser way, I guess, of putting your history together. Well, we already touched on this. I won't spend much time. But why do we have 4 Gospels? They're just different aspects, right, of Jesus' life. We've already touched on Matthew. He's the Jewish Messiah. Luke's the Savior of the world. John is sort of the cosmic Jesus, isn't it? Right? How does John start? In the beginning, the Word, and the Word is with God, and the Word was God. He's up in cosmic land, right? At the very beginning, he's not even on the earth yet. And so we get this transcendent Jesus who comes down as the light and the Word. into the world. So John was probably late enough that he had heard all the stories. He knew what Matthew, Mark, and Luke were doing. He's saying, I'm going to put a different spin on it. I have a different look at Jesus that I want to have. So they're not in disagreement. They're just giving you different aspects. Kind of like if you went to a portrait artist and sat down, and then you went to a second portrait artist. Are they going to capture exactly the same thing? It's still you, but it depends on what lighting and how they want to show you off a little bit.
Hey, Gary,
Yeah.
the whole notion of the scripture is inspired by God. That's
Mhm.
2 Corinthians 15 says.
Right.
So when God reveals things to us, they have our revelation and inspirations have colors and personalities to our. So when they're being inspired at the time that God is revealing this song, so it's not a exact same. They're not robots, right? They're not.
Yeah.
So I think that's the part that we often maybe don't emphasize, that the scriptures are inspired by God. The writers are just instruments; they're just typewriters. So how the revelation comes, and the color and the personality that comes through, because it's coming through human beings.
It is, isn't it great? I mean, I love that. It's like God says, I gave you imaginations, right? Because you're made in the image of God. So take the story of Jesus and filter it the way you feel it'll have the biggest impact. And so there's a creativity that God gives us that you don't see in other religions. Most religions, like Joseph Smith, he's just copying stuff off. Muhammad is it's dictation from God, just copy it off. It's the old idea of, gee, I wonder what God's going to tell me here, But these writers in the 4 Gospels had a chance to maneuver things around to illustrate what they wanted to say. I mean, take the book of Luke, for instance. In Luke, the first, maybe 2/3 covers Jesus' life, and then the last third is just the last week of Jesus' life. That's called pace in literature, right? Pace is how fast you want to make the story move and how slow you want to make the story move. So what are they doing there? Luke is allowed then, he says, the last part of his life, that last week is so important, I'm going to stretch that out and have that occupy a lot of my gospel. Okay. And he skipped over the early years of Jesus' life. And they all did, right? They all thought, I don't care what he did at age 10, right? We'll touch on age 12 and then he's 30. So again, that's a little different than we would think today. Yes, back there.
At the end of John, it says that this disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down, we know that his testimony is true. Jesus did many other things as well. Every one of them were written down. I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written.
So what is John saying there? I didn't put everything in this book. I selected things that I wanted. With John, it's those I am sayings. He's got, I think, 7 of them. And that's the heart of his book, right? I am the way, I am this, I am the resurrection. So he organized his book differently than Matthew. Matthew organizes his around 5 discourses of Jesus, right? Because that's the Jewish way, right? You're communicating and all. So it's very different. Yes?
One of the things that's what I share is fascinating with the Gospels is you look at the 12 tribes of Israel broken up into 4 camps. You look at the standards. Judah had a line. Dan, I think, had a man. I forget the exact ordering, but there were 4 distinct standards. Well, they also line up with Revelation 5 and Ezekiel. You have 4 created creatures. Same exact images. And then when you look there, Matthew, with the king, the lion, the servant, man, or ox was a standard for the beast of burden, savior of the world. Look, it's the man. Because in there you see the humanity of Christ.
Right.
And then, those I am statements. And John, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
You just see it was.
Well, next time you turn to Revelation, if you're going through Revelation, it's a hard book, no doubt about it. But keep in mind, I forgot what the percent is, but a real high percent of Revelation just comes from the Old Testament. It's not John having this weird dream. It's called apocalyptic writing. It was a form of writing. And so you're right. Much of the Old Testament kind of threads its way through into the New Testament. Somebody else had that. Yes?
When you mentioned Joseph Smith and Muhammad, there's only one of each of those. And these, though they don't line up 100% perfectly, they corroborate each other tremendously.
Right.
So in and of itself, that's cross-referencing.
Sometime, again, if you have a chance, type in the term interlocking gospels online, and you'll find how many times a gospel story gets told in one gospel, a story of Jesus, and then another gospel tells you the same story, but it has slightly different aspects to it. And if you put them together, you go, oh, okay. So a real quick example here. Jesus is in front of Pilate. And Pilate, of course, represents the Romans. He doesn't want any threat to Rome. And he asks Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And I forgot which gospel it is. Jesus says, "Yes." And so Pilate turns to the Jews. He says, "I see no reason why we should keep this guy." Now that sounds odd, because if Jesus says, "I'm a king," Pilate should have said, "Away with you," right? We only have one king, and I work for him, and I know that guy, and he pays my salary. You're gone. So you wonder, why would Pilate say everything's fine? Well, you read one of the other Gospels, Pilate asks the same question, "You king of the Jews?" Jesus says, "Yes, I am, but what? My kingdom is not of this world. I am a spiritual king." And so Pilate goes, "Well, I don't have anything to worry about that. You be your spiritual king. I don't care." And he turns to the Jews and says, "I don't see anything wrong with this." But you have to put those two stories together. And so you're right. They support each other in really interesting ways. They call those interlocking gospels. And you can just look it up sometime. People have done some research on this. There are dozens and dozens of these where you hear part of a story and you might kind of scratch your head and go, something's missing, or they didn't give you the whole detail. And you pick it up on another gospel and you go, "Oh, okay." So that's a neat thing to look at. Do you have a question?
Well, I just think it's a lot more believable when you see four different accounts written by four different people to believe it if it's not identical.
That's a good point.
If you read something four ways exactly the same, it looks to me like it was copied from one to the other to
Yes.
the other. There was no, because you're each writing, everybody writes differently.
Yeah.
No one writes exactly the same. You're not going to write the words exactly the same.
Yeah.
So to me, that would be unbelievable. So the argument that they're not identical and there are variations, to me, is a ridiculous argument.
You're right. I've heard police detectives say the same thing. When they interview witnesses, their stories differ a little bit. And if they all said the same, they'd say, "You guys got together and you created that," right? Okay. Okay, so why four Gospels? Oh, let's try it again. How about anything outside the Gospels? I mean, can we believe that there's a Jesus if we only meet him in four Gospels and the stories of what happened to him? Maybe we shouldn't trust that. If it's just the Gospels, they were probably written with trying to change our minds. Maybe they just created these things. Well, absolutely not. Corroboration, would you agree, is important in a courtroom trial? If somebody comes in and says this happened, and you could find four more people that said it happened, that gives it a lot stronger credibility, doesn't it? So we do it in courtrooms today. Here's Tacitus. Remember I mentioned Tacitus? He's considered the premier historian of the Roman Empire. Premier. Okay, so not some local yokel. I mean, this guy is the one that looked at all of Roman history, and people trust him. Here's what he had to say. Nero, right here we go, Nero again, fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty. What do you think that is? Death, right? An extreme penalty, right? It's not your head cut off, right? This is crucifixion. During the reign of Tiberius, at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, and the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. So here's Tacitus. Now, is he a believer? No, he's not a believer. But does he validate the story of Jesus? Yeah, he's got the names, he's got the time period, he's got the kind of death that he had, and he's got the fact that it blossomed there and it spread. That's Tacitus. Yes?
I've heard in the past that until they found a tablet with Pontius Pilate's name on it, there was a lot of people who doubted that he existed, but if this has been out there for so long, why would that be so?
I don't know. Just hard hearts, people. What does it say in Romans? People suppress the truth. They know it's the truth, but they're pushing on it as hard as they can.
Yep.
Let's take somebody else. Here's a non-Roman. This is a Jew. His name is Josephus. He's considered an excellent historian. He was in Jerusalem during the time of the rebellion in the late 60s and 70s. And he saw where things were going. He cautioned the people, don't rise against Rome. Rome is just way too strong. So when the Romans came in, he went over to the Romans. Jews were not real thrilled with that, you can bet. He met Vespasian, and he said, "You're going to be emperor of Rome someday." And Vespasian became emperor of Rome. Now, I don't know how he knew that, but probably just sucking up to him or something. But anyway, so Vespasian becomes emperor of Rome, and he then brings Josephus with him and gives him all the time and energy, just whatever you want to do. So he wrote this history of the Jews. So here's what Josephus said. It's going to be continued on the next slide, but he talks about Jesus. He says, at this time there was a wise man called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. Now notice it doesn't say, I believed him to be the Messiah, right? So he's not a believer. Many people among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die, but those who become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Notice he doesn't say it really happened. He said, this is what they're reporting. Okay, so do you see the difference here? He's not a believer. He's just saying, here's what they were saying. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah. He's kind of, hedging his bets there a little bit. Concerning whom the prophets have reported wonders. And the tribe of the Christians, so named after him, has not disappeared to this day. So this is around 70, 80 AD. It's telling the same story. By the way, I knew we wouldn't have time for it, but he also, in another place in his history, he makes reference to James. And he talks about James dying. He said James was the brother of Jesus. Okay, so he's already telling you something about Jesus having brothers. He's telling you about the time period and all. Again, I like these kinds of quotations because they're not from Christians, but they corroborate the same story. Right? So that's Josephus. Let's go one other place as far as outside of the Gospels referencing the fact that Jesus was around. There's something called the Talmud. Have you heard of that before? It's a commentary on the Jewish Bible, right? It's a commentary. So, like, how do you interpret the Ten Commandments? Well, let me tell you what some of the Jewish thinkers have said, right? So it's commentaries. It's not the Old Testament. It's commentaries on the Old Testament and other things, right? So there's this thing called the Babylonian Talmud. It was put together between 200 and 500 AD. They mention Jesus, and here's what they say. On the eve of the Passover, they hanged Yeshu, that's the name for Jesus, because he practiced sorcery and enticed and led Israel astray. Now, they're obviously an enemy of Jesus, but what do they say in there that kind of lets you know that it really does corroborate what the Gospels are saying? Sorcery. He was doing magic, right? He was actually performing miracles. Supernatural. And it was on the eve of the Passover, so they got the death at the right time period. And says, led Israel astray. So they're admitting that he had an impact, right? He really did change a lot of lives. Now, is that backing up the whole story? No, of course not. But it does say he was there, he lived, he had this kind of a life, right? So we got different sources. We got a Roman source, we got a Jewish source, and then we got later Jewish tradition that talks about this. And they're all saying Jesus really lived. So one more time, nobody should be saying that Jesus didn't live. We can argue, I guess, about what he said and did, but he lived, right? No historian is going to deny that. Well, how about letter I here? This is another issue that's, I've touched on it earlier. Did the early church, and I say early church, I'm talking 300 or 400 AD, right? So somewhere along there, Constantine again. Once they got into power, remember Constantine said that Christianity was okay. So he took off all of the persecution and he became an organized church, right? A state church. So the theory is, this is Da Vinci Code again, the theory is once the church got its power together, then they created the gospel stories. That there were really no stories up till then. They created this cosmic Jesus so they could say, look, we've got a better Jesus, right? He's supernatural. He was just probably lived and probably a nice guy, but we're going to create stories where he performs miracles. He walks on water and he comes back from the dead. Is that really true? Was it a later collection of stories? No. And I got about half a dozen no's up here, right? Reasons why not. Look at how Jesus is shown. Is he shown as this cosmic God? No. He's shown as a real person. He sweats blood. He's upset. He even says he didn't know when he's going to come back. Right? If you're going to make this cosmic Jesus, wouldn't you make Jesus know everything? Right? But as a human, he didn't really know when he was coming back. Right? He says just the Father knows. How are the disciples shown? Doing stupid things. We already touched on that. I love that one scene where they're going down the road and they're standing behind him or walking behind him, griping about who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. I bet he's going, months and months with you people and you still haven't got it right. They fall asleep when he's in his hour of most need. Please watch him, pray for me. He comes back and they're just zonked out there. Oh man, this is his last night on earth and they can't even pay attention. Jesus had some pretty hard sayings. If you're going to make Jesus be this cosmic wise person, you wouldn't have him say things about you got to hate your father and your mother if you follow me, right? That sounds pretty harsh. Jesus doesn't say anything about church matters, right? Once you get a state church set up, then you want to know things like, okay, what's our structure going to look like? What are we going to say about this Holy Spirit business? Jesus doesn't really talk much about food laws. He doesn't talk about that stuff at all. He doesn't talk about church structure. Yea, verily set up an Episcopal, set up a diocese here. And he doesn't say any of that stuff. And then finally, how in the world could they say that these Gospels were created late? They were created early. We've got them in the very earliest list that came out in the 100s AD that says Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. They talk, every time a church father wrote something, guess what he said? 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. There was never any other Gospel. They were always there in the church list, always. So it doesn't work to say these things were created late. That's just a fantasy. Here's a new area that people are concerned with, and now we bring in Bart Ehrman again. And that's called variants. It just means differences. If you took these manuscripts and looked at them, you would see some differences. And I'll show you what we're talking about here. First is Bart Ehrman. He's back on the scene. What can we say about the total number of variants? In other words, the differences as they've copied things off. He says scholars differ, but there may be 200,000, 300,000, maybe even 400,000. He says there are more variations than there are words in the New Testament. There's something like 150 or 200,000 words. Now, that statement is true, but it's way misleading. Doesn't that make you feel like, wow, we're in trouble here, right? There aren't 2 words in a row that we can trust. Well, Ehrman's got this history. The way he does things, he tells you part of the story, but not the whole story. Okay, so just be aware of that. He's not lying, but he hasn't told you the rest of the story. So let's look and see what these variations are. Most of them are just spelling. So they spell Jesus and they don't spell it like they spell it other places. Does that ruin your faith? That's about as silly as it gets, right? If they spell John differently in one place, but it spells something, right? That's counted as a variation. It's a difference. And you add those things up. And remember, we got how many manuscripts? Thousands. So if you misspell John in 2000, right, that's 2,000 variants you've got right there, 2,000 differences. So most of them are just spelling problems. No big deal. Number 2, there's some weird things in Greek. For example, you can put the in front of somebody's name. You can say, the Mary and the Joseph went down to, give birth. Anybody confused by that? No. Nobody understands why they do that. Nobody's ever figured that out. Why do you put the in front of some proper name? I don't know. The guy who wrote a PhD on this said he never understood it. He got his PhD and he said, I don't get it either. So does that ruin any of the gospel messages? No, absolutely not. How about number 3? There are some variants, but they were so late, they got added hundreds of years later. Nobody thinks that was part of the original. So there's some more. So now we've gotten down to just a handful. And there are, yes there are, a few that do make a slight difference, but don't alter any of the core doctrines that we have. Let me give you some examples. Anybody have a Bible with you here? Look at the end of the book of Mark. I bet you know about this already. Look at Mark 16:9 and tell me what your Bible says. I bet you have a footnote. What does it say? Added later, not in the earliest manuscripts. Okay, well let me ask you, would that ruin your faith? Would you walk away from Christianity if you didn't have those last few verses? Absolutely not. How does that hurt anything? We've got 4 accounts of Jesus' life. Right? So what's the big deal there? The other big one, this is it. These are the only 2 that involve several verses. Here's the second one, John 7:53. See if you can find that and tell me what it says there. This is the famous story of catching the woman in adultery, and they bring her before Jesus, and he says, let him who has no sin cast the first stone.
The most ancient Greek manuscripts do not include this passage.
Okay, it's not in the oldest. Now, does that mean Jesus didn't really do that? No. It could have been a later person who was copying said, gee, Jesus, I've heard this great story about Jesus from different sources. I trust it. I'll put it in. So it doesn't mean he didn't do it, but it just is not in the best original sources. That's it. Those are the only 2 places where you have an extensive chunk of the Scripture. Now you tell me, do either of those say that Jesus never lived? Do either of those say Jesus sinned? No. Do either of those say Jesus didn't really die? Do any of those say, right? They don't cover any of the core doctrines. It would be nice to have that story. It'd be nice if it was true. We don't need it. right? It's a great story. I love the story, but it's not necessary to your faith. Now, are there a few minor things? Yeah. Luke 23, Jesus having drops of sweat like blood. It's not in all manuscripts. People are not really sure. Romans 5:1. You look at that sometime. Well, let's just take a second. Can you look it up and see? Yours should have a note there, however yours reads it. Yours either says, let us have peace, or we have peace. But I bet there's a footnote. Does yours say, mine has a note at the bottom that says,
let us have peace.
Yours says, let us have peace. Does it say there is an alternate?
Some manuscripts read, let us have peace.
Oh, okay.
It says, we have peace.
Yeah, so yours is going with this one, but says there are some that say this. Okay, again, is this anything that's going to shatter somebody's faith? No. And there are a few other places where things like this are going on. So are there some differences? Yes, there are. Minor. But do you see the difference between what Ehrman told you? Oh, we have all of these differences. And what's his implication? We can't trust any of it. But guess what? They've already found them. It's not like you're reading a verse and you're going, gee, I wonder if this is legit. They've found these problem areas. They're all noted for you in your own Bibles. So Ehrman's told you half the story. Yes, there are some differences. Are they big? He doesn't tell you that. No, they're not. And are they found? Yes, they are. People know where the differences are. Do you know they've done some research lately on Revelation? This is interesting. It's absolutely pointless, but it's interesting to me. They have found that number of the beast, 666, in many of the earliest manuscripts say 616. So there goes Tim LaHaye's stuff, maybe. I don't know. So people have done some studies on this. They're going, gee, I don't know. Yeah.
You asked about the account of Philip and the eunuch when he's being baptized. In some of the Bibles it says, if you believe, you may be baptized. And so that does make a difference in terms of theology. That, for example, infant baptism would be discounted by that statement.
Oh, I don't know that one. I'll have to look that one up. So that's the Philip story, huh?
Is it Acts? Is that in
Acts? Yeah. Okay. I'll look that up, but I don't have anything good to... I don't want to say something and have to retract it later. So, let's talk about the variants for just a minute. Guess who said this? Essential Christian beliefs are not affected by these variants. Bart Ehrman. See what I mean? I mean, he's sort of honest in one spot, and then later on he says, don't worry about it. But he just told you to worry about it before, right? He told you there's 300,000, 400,000. There are more variants than there are verses. Yeah, now that I've got you upset. But his honesty will come out here and there. Yes?
What about prophecy? Hundreds of years before, certain prophecies concerning Jesus, would he be? How would he die? What would he do?
Yeah.
And then 500 years later, it's all come true.
Right.
I mean, that's the core. It's all the core of the gospel. It's about Christ. He's the main core.
Yeah.
So that is, for me, it's the main thing. It's prophecy. It's prehistory.
Yes.
Foretold. And when that comes true, exactly how it's said in the Psalms, in Isaiah. Isaiah was found in the manuscript. And that's like a mini Bible. The early disciples, they did everything they had was from the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. There is nothing that they didn't take out of that.
Yeah, we're gonna cover prophecies when we talk about the uniqueness of Jesus. And you mentioned Isaiah. Some people call that the fifth gospel because there's so much about Jesus in there that the New Testament writers used. So Bart Ehrman is actually way more with us than we would think. So he's honest. I think I'm going to skip this because of time. Or we could just do the first phrase. How about this? I took a poem by Byron because I like poetry. So I messed with it and I pretended that they were three different variants, right? Three different wordings. And to pretend that we were textual critics, how do you recreate these things? Well, first one says she walks in beauty, and then something happens at the end, gets smeared up. You don't know how that word ends. You find your second manuscript says she, and then that word gets messed up, and it says in peace. You got a third one, she walks on beauty, right? So you got three different readings of this, but if you look back and forth, would you agree since she is in all of them, it's probably she? And then I see walks, and I see an ED, and I see a walks again. Which one do you think is probably the original? You go with the majority, right? It's probably walks. And then the in, the on. Which one are you going to reject? Probably the on, right? So see what we're doing? I mean, just real quickly here. This is 3. Imagine you get 5,000 New Testament ones. So beaut, something goes wrong. This says peace, this says beauty. Chances are it's the beauty one, right? So you reconstruct that. She walks in beauty. Right, so we could do that without us even knowing, the reference to this thing. And if we had more time, we could do the rest of it too, but I'm going to move along. But that's how textual criticism works. A textual critic just looks at ancient manuscripts, tries to figure out what did the original say. So you just did it. You recreated, in a sense, the original meaning of a poem. Let's keep going though. This is a biggie. What about other Gospels? Remember, Bart Ehrman said there were, or no, it was Da Vinci Code said there were like 60 Gospels, or 80, I forgot how many they used. Well, what about these other Gospels? Are there some around? Yeah. They found some manuscripts at a place called Nag Hammadi in Egypt in the mid-40s, in 1940s. So inside these, they found something called the Gospel of Thomas. And people have latched onto that, and they have written books on it, and they've made a huge deal about the Gospel of Thomas. And they're saying, this should have been one of the ones that were, at one time should have been part of the New Testament. So, and some of them call it the 5th Gospel as well. Well, let's take a look at Gospel of Thomas. Let me give you 3 verses. You can look up online. This is not hidden stuff. Just type in Gospel of Thomas. All it is, it's not a story. It's like 150 or 120 sayings of Jesus. That's all it is. He said, he said, he said, he said. Here are 3 of them. You tell me, does this sound like the Jesus from the New Testament? And he said, whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death. Here's another one. He says, let him who seeks continue seeking until he finds. When he finds, he will become troubled. When he becomes troubled, he will be astonished, and he will rule over the all. Last one, become passers-by. You know what this sounds like? Does this sound kind of new agey to you? There it is. This is not the Jesus in the Gospels. This is Jesus of secret knowledge. Okay, so you ever heard that word Gnosticism? Gnostics? This is Gnostic, right? This is, hey, you'll get eternal life if you just catch what I'm saying. And so you listen to him and you go, I think I got it. And then you go out and you say, I got secret knowledge now. I'm on my way. I got it figured out. So it's not Jesus dying for us, it's Jesus coming bringing secret knowledge. And if you get it, good for you, right? And if you don't get it and you scratch your head, well, tough luck. This is a very different Jesus, but that's what's in the Gospel of Thomas. It's full of Gnosticism, which came later than the 4 Gospels. Gnosticism is in the 2nd century. So this is not the time of Jesus. This is not Thomas really writing as somebody pretending to be Thomas, and it's influenced very heavily from a different philosophical background. It doesn't sound like the 4 Gospels at all. It doesn't give you the same idea of Jesus. Should we consider, and there are others that have been found. There's one called the Gospel of Peter, and there's one, I forgot. Anyway, there's a bunch of them. Yeah, so there were other Gospels written. But here's the problem with them. They're later. If you don't remember anything else, they are later. They're not during the 1st century. They're in the 2nd, some of them even in the 3rd century. They weren't written by the writers who knew Jesus. There was not widespread usage. They got rejected every place they showed up. They had these goofy teachings. And they were rejected. Every time the church said, these are the Gospels that we trust, Thomas was never on the list. He was never on the list. So it's just an attempt to turn Jesus into a modern-day guru. Right? So it's a very different kind of Jesus. A final thought here. Now, I didn't put the author's name. The oldest and best sources we have for knowing about the life of Jesus are what? The 4 Gospels. This is not simply the view of Christians, right? He's saying it's not Christian. It's a view of all his serious historians. He says all the way from evangelical Christians to hardcore atheists. Well, we could all chant this together. Who said this? Bart Ehrman. So again, notice the honesty here. I thought that was interesting. He's trying to tear down the faith, but he's always stops because there's an element of truth to his life that he has to say, look, if you want to know about Jesus, don't mess with the Gospel of Thomas. Don't mess with these other things. This is it. This is actually at the end of a book of his where he criticized the Da Vinci Code. So he doesn't think the Da Vinci Code was correct at all. He says, that's nonsense. It's the four Gospels. It's not Thomas. It's not any of those others. This is where you go if you want to learn about that. Let me share with you, and then we'll stop here. I'm not going to take the time on this, but there are some books that you might enjoy to follow up to what we've been talking about. One's called Cold Case Christianity. It's by a cold case detective, J. Warner Wallace, who's been on television shows. And this is a fantastic book. It talks about these same issues that we were talking about today. And he's studied a lot on this area. And so this book has become just a classic. This is where I got a lot of my information. It's a much smaller book. It's not threatening at all. If you want one that does kind of a quick once-over, it's by Mark D. Roberts. It's called Can We Trust the Gospels? It's very easy reading. I know you'd enjoy it. And then one last one, and you've heard me mention this one before. It's a little more detailed. I don't know if you want anything in that much depth. But it'll talk about Luke, why he was a good historian. Some of those things I was telling you about the ports and the way the winds blew and all that kind of stuff. It's in there. So it's a book called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Well, that's a whirlwind tour. So it is, again, I'll send you the notes if you want to contact me. I think I've got an email down there that you can get back to me. Anybody have a question?
In speaking with a Muslim friend, one of the main hang-ups for her is, we can't trust the New Testament because it's in the English language that's been translated, and Jesus didn't really die on the cross, it was Judas. Yeah. Where are those objections coming from? Are they just within Islam, or are they based on some other...
See, that's another really good one that we just didn't have time for. People worry about the translations, because here's how they think translations work. They think that you had the originals, and then somebody translated that into Latin, let's say, and then somebody translated that into early English, and then somebody translated that into the King James, right? That was like 1611. And then that got translated. That's called a linear form of translating. And here we are, right? Way down here in 2015, and we're like 20 translations away from the originals. Is that the way it happened? We keep going back to the originals, and we keep finding more of them so we can get closer and closer and closer. Not further away, we're getting closer. So the King James Bible, for instance, the one that people, spend centuries adoring and worshiping out of, they only had a half a dozen, I think, maybe 8 manuscripts way back. And those manuscripts only went back to like the year 1000. And so they translated based on those. What do we have now? 5,000. And they're way back. They're much closer to the original. So as far as translation problems, we're in really good shape. But yeah, people, I think they have that image that it's linear translating that's going on. It's not. We're actually going back closer to the original.